good with that?
Yes.
Okay. So what's interesting when we look at sex is that most of us have not had our chromosomes or our hormones checked. Unless we're having fertility or menopausal issues, most of us don't know what our chromosomal makeup is or what our hormone levels are. Some of us have experienced puberty where one particular hormone spikes over the other one, but we don't necessarily know what our actual levels are, but our sex assignment is based on assuming that your exterior genitalia or external genitalia is perfectly in alignment with the accompanying chromosomal pair as well as a hormone that will take over, have a higher level, right? So if a fetus has a penis, then of course it's XY, and of course it will have higher levels of testosterone. We'd make those assumptions. Now it's not always the case, and this is where someone who has intersex condition or possibly is intersexed, there's controversy over the language there within the community. But intersex people or person with intersex condition is when the anatomical or biological parts do not perfectly align. So that's kind of where that exists on the left side. Let me do the hand right, on the left side of the triangle. Now, the other thing that's important to know about sex before we move on is what I call secondary sex characteristics. So if you want to draw like a box on the left side of your triangle, these are characteristics of your body that are directly related to your hormone levels that we then interpret. So an example of this would be hair, or size, or voice, or Adam's apples. When those things are expressed in your body, it's generally related to estrogen or testosterone levels. So for example, if you perceived me to be a woman, then you may assume that my estrogen level is high, and because my estrogen level is high, I store fat on my chest and in my hips. But if my testosterone level was higher, then I would store fat more typically in my belly. Now what's interesting though when we talk about breasts is that the fat stored on one's chest, if you read that person is female, you would know them as breasts. But if you read that person is male, then you would think of them as man boobs instead of breasts, right? But there's a very different social connotation related to that. Same thing with facial hair. If you perceive me to be female and I have facial hair, there's like a secret aisle in the grocery store to compare to that. But if you perceived me as male and I had facial hair because my testosterone level is higher, I could have no shave November. I could have lamb chops, I could have a goatee, I could shave it all off, because that's how we socially work with the secondary sex characteristics that are based on the hormone production in your body. So before we move on to gender, are there any questions about anatomy, biology, or sex? Panel or people in the room?
No.
Nope.
Okay. I appreciate a person in the pink shirt. What's your name?
Susan.
Susan, do I have a thumbs up? Keep going.
Thumbs up.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so that was sex. So then if we go to the right corner of the triangle, then we have gender. Now what's fascinating about gender is that it evolves over time, and we totally made it up. We completely and totally made it up. So let me give you an example, and then we'll break it down a little bit. So let's say that I'm talking about George W. George W. goes rolling into a meeting. If George W. is wearing a powdered wig and makeup and French silk with Italian lace ruffles, velvet knickers, and platform buckle shoes, I could be talking about George Washington, because as a white male president of the United States, that is how we expressed masculine power. If I was talking about George W. Bush, dressing like that might have done something for his approval ratings, By that point, that's not how white male US presidents express their masculinity anymore, because it changed and evolved over time. This happens because we make it up. There's really nothing else to it, we just make it up. So let's break down a little bit of what I mean by it, by making it up. And I've divided gender into 4 different categories. The 4 different categories, they spell RIPE, R-I-P-E. So you have roles, identity, perception, and expression. Roles, identity, perception, and expression. So between those 4 elements, that is actually how we've socially constructed gender. What's fascinating is that roles, identities, and expressions are what we do to send messages out to you, right? So this is what I do so that when someone walking down the street is gathering the information that I want them to, because I want them to know how I identify, how I'm choosing to express myself, and the roles that I take on. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that your roles, your identities, and your expressions don't necessarily have to be congruent, but it is the information that people use in order to actually perceive somebody else's gender. Now, if you'll circle perception, the trick about perception is that it's the one we have no control over. No matter what I do, I can't make someone perceive me the way I wish they would. I can hope they would, right? But I can't make someone perceive me the way I wish they would. So what's key, or what you can do about perception, is that you can actually pay attention to what you need in order to perceive somebody else. So I'm in airports all the time. So what I do is I play a little game with myself. So when someone is coming up or crossing the sidewalk or walking behind me, I try to guess what that person's gender is, and then I try to look at what characteristics did I need to look at in order to determine their gender. So for me, for example, facial hair. If you have facial hair, you're going to register as a dude to me. Even if you're not, I will go there first. It's like a tipping point for me. The other thing I think is really interesting is the sound of footsteps. So if I'm just sitting there or I'm walking down a hallway and I hear somebody coming up behind me, based on the sound of the footsteps, I will perceive who is walking behind me. And I will actually adjust how I behave based on who I think is behind me. The reason why perception is so important is that this is how judgments and assumptions are made. And I think it's important to understand that by perceiving someone else, you're also potentially validating how they want to express themselves and how they want to identify themselves. What's interesting when we start talking about trans inclusion is so often we want the other person to fit in to our judgments and assumptions instead of us realizing maybe we didn't have enough information. And so pausing and gathering more information. When you look at roles, identities, and expressions, this can be your job, your relationships, your identities or the labels that you use to describe yourself or your relationships, and your expressions are the clothes you wear, how you wear your hair, how you walk down the street, how you sit in a chair. All of those pieces are messages that we send out to other people so that the other people can potentially perceive our truth and validate our truth. So that's how I see gender. But it often gets conflated together with sex, but they're actually should be broken apart into 2 separate entities. So I'm going to pause there. How are we doing on questions? Thoughts, comments?